bunch of flyers in the back, so for those of you who are interested in learning more about the minor, we have some information about the minor in Jewish studies. We also have a study abroad program to Jerusalem in July, and Professor Benjamin Lorch, James Madison College professor, is leading it this summer. So he's an amazing teacher for those of you who haven't had it, and we have really generous scholarships that pay for your entire program fee. So if you want to talk to him afterwards or to anyone else afterwards, don't hesitate to do that. So there's a lot to talk about this evening. So it is my distinct pleasure. Some of you may have been here. I gave a talk like this in this room after the April elections. And we are especially thrilled to have with us inside scoop about the election from Professor Alon Tal. I know some of you are taking his Israeli Politics, Cultures, and Society class or his environmental population class and are here for that. He's the chair of the Department of Public Policy at Tel Aviv University, and we are very lucky that he teaches here before his semester there starts, and it's his 5th time, I think, teaching here at James Madison College. He loves our students, and I think it's mutual. He has a really interesting background. He's published 5 books, the last several, I think, with Yale University Press. He used to be co-chair of the Green Party in Israel. He's Mr. Environmentalist in Israel as well, and has started kind of an environmental defense fund-like group. He started the Arava Institute at Kibbutz Keturah in the Negev in Israel, which brings Israelis, Palestinians, and Jordanians together to look at environmental challenges and solutions together. He got his law degree, I think, at Hebrew University and a PhD from Harvard University in environment and public health. And he was found in a way, and was on the list, and is on the list of the new Blue and White Party, and has been campaigning extensively for months now for that party, mainly on environmental issues. He was here to teach, went back to vote in the election and do some last-minute campaigning for the election. And I think, what time did you arrive here?
The plane landed at 2 in the morning.
The plane landed at 2 in the morning. You probably didn't get here till 4 in the morning. Then he taught 2 classes for 6 hours. Took a quick nap and is back with us. So he has the latest inside scoop. So I'm really eager to learn from him. When he's done, I'll give my little 2 cents, and then we'll open it up for questions and discussion. If you're uncomfortable, you need a chair, go across the hall and just grab one. Yeah. And there's 3 open chairs here, if you want to sit here.
Thanks very much, Yael. This is a wonderful opportunity to be here. And I think it continues sort of a theme of the week for me that the numbers are higher than I expected. So I'm really so grateful that everybody could come out and talk about these very dramatic elections. We're still internalizing what they mean, and the final results are not in, but I think we have enough of an impression. This is an opportunity to thank James Madison College once again for bringing me over and making me part of your tremendous community. I've been at many universities. Michigan State offers something extremely special, and it's really a pleasure to be here. And I'm especially happy to give this talk tonight. I wasn't sure whether I'd be talking in a sort of a discouraged or euphoric state, and I think the latter is more appropriate. So I think it's important to start with that initial disclosure of bias, that this would be a very different lecture if it was given perhaps by a professor who's been very active in the Likud party or in other political parties. But for somebody who's been involved since the last 7 months since it was originally established in the Blue and White Party, we had a great meeting so far, and it'll be very hard for me to hold that out. So I want people to, although I will try very hard within the academic context to offer facts and figures and objective perspectives. I'm not fooling anybody. I'm engaged, involved, and I'm biased, and let's get started. So for those who are not familiar with Israel's government, we have a system of government which is based around a parliamentary election, 120 seats in our Knesset based on the ancient rabbinical Knessets of the past. And if you have enough votes, if your party can bring together a coalition of 61, a majority, then you can become the executive branch of Israel. So it's somewhat different than the US. Of course, there is a separation of powers in Israel. We have an independent judiciary, and the executive, in theory, is supposed to be overseen and checked and balanced by the parliament. In fact, the Knesset elections determine the control of both the executive and the legislature, and I think there had been different outcomes, even the judicial as well. This particular election, like the last ones, but even more so than other, surrounded around the personality and the record and the ambitions of Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu. Yael is an expert in the psychology of leaders in general and Israeli leaders particularly. She can probably give more in-depth analysis. Just for those who are not familiar with Prime Minister Netanyahu's storied biography, he grew up in a family of academics. His father was a famous professor of Jewish history, but he failed to get tenure in Israel, presumably because of political reasons, because the family was more on the right-wing side, and academia in those days was much more it had its own inclinations. Anyway, he spent many of his formative years in Philadelphia, which means he speaks Hebrew and English. He's very comfortable in many societies. His brother is an iconic Israeli hero, was head of our top commando unit, something like the SEALs, and was the only Israeli soldier tragically to die in the famous Entebbe raid, which released hostages there back in 1976. And he went on to serve in the same unit, and then came to the States and did his studies at MIT. He's very smart, he's very erudite, and he was discovered quite young and became a very young ambassador to the United Nations. And from there it was a short distance to become the head of the Likud party. And what we now saw this year, setting the record, even eclipsing founding father David Ben-Gurion's 13 years as prime minister. So he has been now for so many years prime minister. For example, my daughter Zoe, who is 19, can't remember what life was like with a different prime minister. That to her is the government. And we see pictures of her. She's not necessarily thrilled by his record, but he has undoubtedly established for himself and for Israel a place on the world stage which is remarkable. In other words, he's had more hours with President Modi than any other world leader, more hours of meetings with Putin, with President Trump and the like. In other words, as a fairly small country with a modest economy and a small range, he's managed to play with the big leagues with lots of people, and Israelis like that and appreciate that. And he's also had his imprint on the Israeli economy and the like. So he's been a formidable figure. The second person in our drama is Avichai Mandelblit, okay? A man who grew up secular at age 24, became very religious, spent most of his career in the military as a prosecutor, and then went on to become the secretary of the government, of the cabinet for Israel. And so when the Prime Minister Netanyahu had to appoint a new attorney general, he said, well, this guy was the chief legal officer of the Israeli army, and I made him this, I think I'll make him my attorney general. There's some sensitive issues. I know the police is investigating me. It would be nice to have a close colleague in that job who decides who gets indicted and who didn't. And he made maybe the worst calculation for his personal political career of his career, because Mandelblit can say many things about him, but he has shown, I think, tremendous independence and courage. And therefore, this year, in the peak of the previous election, he released his report about 3 criminal investigations which involved the Prime Minister. Describe them all in depth. We'll take the whole evening just as a summary. One of them involved receiving gifts, largely cigars and champagne, from a Hollywood mogul, and presumably giving him political favors in return. Another case has, unfortunately for Netanyahu, he was recorded making deals with what was then Israel's largest newspaper editor, saying, if you give me favorable coverages, I'll give you some help with other areas, and that was considered also a form of corruption, not the kind where you put money in your pocket, but a breach of trust. And finally, perhaps the most severe one, the multimillionaire Shaul Elovitch was given control of a government communications projects in return for favorable coverage on his news website, Walla. Okay, and this was considered by the Attorney General in all cases to be criminal, and therefore he announced his intention to file an indictment subject to a hearing for the Prime Minister. This created a unique situation for Prime Minister Netanyahu because he all of a sudden became extremely vulnerable. In other words, if matters continue and to unfold as they seem to be, it looked like he was going to jail, not to another 5th term as Prime Minister. But he realized also that laws of immunity for prime ministers are different in different countries. For example, in France, you can't indict a standing prime minister. And so it might make sense for Israel to adopt a law like France, or even give the same kind of protection the US president enjoys. And so, although he sort of denied it when he would be interviewed, it became very clear from discussions that he was very interested in laws that would be submitted which would grant special immunity to the prime minister. And if he could have enough votes to have those laws adopted, it would essentially make him above the law, and these cases may not disappear entirely, but they would go away for the next 5 or 10 years. And so that is sort of the dynamics leading up to the dramatic establishment of the Blue and White Party in January of this year. Now, I want to say that there are a lot of political parties in Israel. There's going to be 10 in the upcoming Knesset. I'm going to focus on 2, although other ones will be mentioned tangentially, and perhaps there's a lot to say about them. And that's because as time goes on, Israel has become much more of a 2-party system than it used to be. At least that's how I think these last 2 elections have come out. So the other personality involved is this. This is when I first met him. He already had a haircut because he was in the army. A man named Benny Gantz. When I was 17, I was on a gap year. I was adopted by a family. I was milking cows in a moshav in the middle of the country, and my adopted mother to me said, "Alon, finish the milking early today. We're going to see my brother is finishing basic training. There's a big ceremony." And that was her brother. Okay, so I've known him since he was 18. He's a year older than me. And Benny Gantz was on, and 3 years later, as luck would have it, when I moved to Israel and was served in the paratroop units, he became my company commander. So I've known him for many years and seen him in many things, and he was as remarkable and outstanding a military commander as I've ever seen. Brave, fun to spend time with, tremendous sense of abilities, a good listener, a leader. And so he went on, and we said already when he was 21 or 22, then if he doesn't become the head of the Israeli army, there's something wrong with the system. And indeed, he did become head of the Israeli army, which in Israel is quite an iconic position. People have great respect for the people who run the army. And so when the country was looking for a leader who might be able to give a serious fight to Netanyahu, because part of the problem was there's no other person that people thought had the stature and ability, all of a sudden Benny's name came up again and again and again. And after 3 years of being out of the military, because that's the law, you have to have a period of time so that we don't have military putches, he decided to throw his hat in the ring and start a party, and for a variety of reasons, and just as he announced the candidates, was asked to be number 20 on his list, and I said, that's an offer I can't refuse, and so but before we could become a party of 20, he merged with another right-wing party. This is a guy named Moshe, or Boogie, as we call him, Ya'alon, who was also head of the Israeli army for many years, and he was then the defense minister, and he started another party, a little more right-wing, and they thought, well, if we want to be a strong centrist party, we need to have our right-wing bona fides. So they merged, and I went from 20 to 25, but that was a good thing, because the party in the polls went way up. And then, here we are at the voting rally, and then this gentleman on the right, his name is Yair Lapid, who had started 7 years ago, a other centrist party, very secular, very, very sort of a middle-class, liberal party. His name is Yair Lapid. He had about 12 or 13 seats in the polls, and it was clear from our surveys that if we would merge together, all of a sudden we could be maybe even the largest party in Israel, out of nowhere. And that merger took place, and it was great for the party. I went from 25 to 45 on the list, which is why I'm here now, not at the list. But it was very, very savvy move, and overnight, all of a sudden, there was a one-on-one. For the first time, there was a sense there's 2 parties competing for this. Okay, and that was the drama that led up to April's election in the past. Okay, now what are the substantive differences now that we've heard between these 2 parties? And again, take it with a grain of salt, because you're hearing from a candidate who's been going around preaching the differences in the following ways. But if we take the issue of religious freedom, okay, pluralism, to what extent we're going to allow transportation on Saturday, to what extent we're going to allow all streams of Judaism to pray at the Western Wall, open up the whole local religious authorities. We in the Blue and White Party have always had a very open and liberal policy that there needs to be more religious freedom, as opposed to the Likud, whose natural coalitional parties are religious parties who've always been very loyal to Likud, and in return they expect for there to be loyalty on the Likud side to their position, which is that there is an Orthodox brand of Judaism, which is the authentic, original brand, and that should drive religion and state policies. Other areas that we are big believers in strengthening the judiciary, making an independent set of Supreme Court, maintaining the Israeli Supreme Court's tremendous historical judicial and I would say activism, while the Likud doesn't believe in judicial activism, think the court has gone too far and has put forward a series of laws which would limit the ability of the Supreme Court to strike down the constitutionality of laws and the like. So that's another major substantive differences. On the issue of peace, which is of course a big one, how are we going to deal with our Palestinians? We always say, I'll tell you what I say when I would go to around parliament meetings, if you want peace now, you probably shouldn't vote for peace, you shouldn't vote for the Blue and White Party. But if you don't want annexation now, and you want to start a sustainable, long-term, serious dialogue with the neighbors, we're a party to vote for. It's a centrist party, which has learned the lessons of years of conflict, and is very cautious, but is very, very committed to not leaving the conflict with the Palestinians to the next generation. We want to make a solution. This is part of our, whereas I think that the Likud policy has been more or less to be evasive of reaching solutions, largely because many of the key coalitional partners don't ever want to give back an inch of the West Bank, and any negotiations could lead to those kind of things. Anyway, there's definitely the alacrity of the parties to engage in the peace process is somewhat different. The fourth difference would be is that our party, as a centrist party, is very much opposed to giving out pork payments to small special interests, whereas that has been one of the characteristics, not that the Likud party wants it, but in order to keep its partners in place, it has always been very generous in giving, for example, religious parties extra funds for their schools and for pet projects and the like, and we think that that's inappropriate. Our party has always been in favor of having a unity government. In general, trying to change the discourse. I'll talk about the stylistic difference. Whereas the Likud says, no, we shouldn't have a unity government. That'll be a paralyzed government. We want to have a narrow government, 61 seats on the right, that can really move forward a right-wing agenda. And the last one, which maybe is the most important of all, on the issue of corruption. We're zero tolerance to any form of corruption. We think that it's outrageous that a standing prime minister, after getting this kind of a report from an attorney general, would step down and acknowledge that he needs to now, if he's innocent, let him defend himself, but not spend his time trying to obfuscate the legal process when he needs to face it. Where the Likud commitment is to try to grant immunity for the prime minister. So these are some of the substantive differences. There's also stylistic differences. This is a campaign we had from April where we said there's two different options for the country. Either you can have Am Yisrael Chai, the state of Israel lives, or Kahana Chai. These are right-wing politicians we felt are sort of racist. I have a brief YouTube which has some of the 2 minutes describing the kinds of political campaigns. I thought it might be fun to see some of the commercials that were in the campaign. So give me just a second. We'll put that up.
I never heard anything so fast.
Our strawberry poppy seed salad is only available right now. Why? Because right now is
There we go. I think get the volume here up.
Hello and welcome to Haaretz.com. I am a white
here?
man who explains. The election is coming to Israel, much like winter is coming to Westeros. But while winter brings dragons and naked people to HBO, the election brings wackadoo campaign videos to Israel, where the production values are low and the profits are Palestinian. We here at Haaretz understand this can be quite overwhelming with so many zany options to choose from. So here is our top 5 Louis campaigns and candidates to look out for in the party primaries and general elections. Number 5, Lieutenant Colonel Dr. M.K. Anat Berko. In a scene that appears
This is
to be
not the
cut
video
from
that I
Fowler
thought
because
it was.
it's not.
So I'm
Lieutenant
gonna
Colonel
turn this
Dr.
off
Anat
now.
Berko is vaccinated.
Sorry about that, this happened, but we'll move forward. There's others all the same, maybe I'll find it before this. Anyway, I want to talk about some of the stylistic difference in our, there's no question about it that the successful abuse of fake news in campaigns is something which is reverberating around the world. Certainly we saw it in the April elections where a steady barrage of imprecise or downright lies about Benny Gantz or the Blue Party were constantly coming through from various and sundry websites that you couldn't trace. The assumption was that 40 to 50% of the websites reporting news on the elections were false. And yet these were very nicely shared by certainly the Prime Minister's son in his web. So there was a lot of
Yusuf's dad. The other thing that was troubling was that the prime minister realized the suspicion between Jews and Arabs was a healthy way to build the support for his party. And so certainly in the last week, we saw a very ugly, I felt, campaign targeting Arabs, assuming that they were disloyal to the state of Israel, and arguing that if you support anybody but the Likud party, essentially you are crowning and giving the Arabs the run of the store and opening the date to the destruction of the state of Israel and all these kind of things. Also in the recent weeks, Netanyahu, in order to strengthen his position, has increasingly divulged military secrets about attacks in Lebanon that typically had been vague or denied. All of a sudden, Israel came forward and said, yes, we're doing this, to give this sense of, yes, we have a powerful prime minister who can support that. Demonization of opponents is something which has been very, very troubling. This notion that if you're not with the Likud, you are an enemy of the state, you're disloyal. Maybe some of these tropes you've heard of in the United States once or twice. And then the other difference might be is that when we created this party, we sat down with different ones. I worked on the environmental side, the 47-page platform, very specific on every conceivable issue you could want. And the Likud doesn't have a platform at all. So that's a stylistic difference between the different parties. So the other thing which matters, I would think a little bit more, is that there has been in the last recent years a tendency for Netanyahu to reveal his leanings for the Republican Party. It started, I think, for the most part when Senator Romney was running for president, and he welcomed him to Israel very warmly, but it reached a peak during the Obama administration when relations were not so great between Netanyahu and President Barack Obama, and then the shift over to be so friendly with President Trump. A lot of people on the blue and white have been critical that it sacrifices a very important strategic interest of Israel, which is by the sort of bipartisan support of all parties in the United States, given that role. Okay, so why, I've now painted this very jaundiced view of the Likud party and the differences. Why are so many Israelis voting for Bibi? Well, there's four things I think that really motivate Israelis when you talk to them. Why are you supporting them? They're all around the country. The first is that Israel has become a much more prosperous country in the last 10 years. And a lot of people feel like, you know, if you look at the economy where I was 10 years ago, my family could never travel abroad. Prices have come down, my salary's gone up, I can travel to Europe, I have more resources, and that's because Bibi knows how to run an economy. He runs that, and I think that's it. The second one is that the last 10 years have been the safest years ever for Israeli citizens. Almost no terrorist attacks on a daily basis. Israelis feel safe. Of course, we have a problem with the Gaza Strip, which causes a bit of turbulence, but that is a conflict which is largely managed by most Israelis. On the whole part, I think that most Israelis feel comfortable sending their kids on buses and going to crowded discotheques, something that wasn't true perhaps of different administrations. The pride in the diplomatic stature, Israel all of a sudden feels like they have friends around the world. And many Israelis sort of began to believe after 10 years, there's nobody who can really replace him. He's experienced, he's well known, his English is so good, how can we ever find somebody with that kind of thing? Well, that brings us up to the election campaign of April. Here's Benny voting with his wife for Vital. He met her when she was in the army. And by the way, Benny is very tall. He's like 6'2", which is unusual in the Israeli context, but it makes it very easy to spot him. Okay. So in round one, the talk, those of you who attended Yale's talk, this is what we had then. We had then a face-off, 35-35. Remember, we're talking about 120 seats in the Knesset. And you can see here, at that point, it looked like the Likud had actually won, not in terms of their numbers versus the blue and white, but the coalition they put together. They seemed like they had something like 65 seats of right-wing parties. But what they didn't realize is that one of the parties, a party called Israel Zahon, Yisrael Beitenu, with 5 seats, which had always been on the right side, its party chairman, Victor Lieberman, a former close colleague of Netanyahu, now a very, very contentious, I wouldn't say an enemy, but an adversary of his, decided he wasn't going to play ball with Netanyahu anymore, that he was tired of having narrow governments which gave so much leverage and influence to the religious parties, and he was not going to support a government like that. And therefore, when Netanyahu came after the time that was necessary to form a coalition, he only had 60 votes. He didn't have 65 votes. And so he was forced, he could have, what the law would have expected to do is pass over the mandate to form a government to the blue and white party, because they had also a pretty good chance. But rather than that, he disbanded the Knesset. For the first time, Israelis went to elections twice in one time. And so he got into the new campaign, and there we went. Now, the Likud campaign was largely based, again, like on the stature of Netanyahu. Donald Trump was on every billboard you can imagine, and it says here, Netanyahu, in a league of his own. Look who his friends are, you know, and that was sort of the nature, him using this as a... Now, our campaign was very different. This is a picture of me at the victory party 2 nights ago. In fact, I haven't had time to cut off the band let me in the party. This is Miki Chaimovich. She's the highest ranking woman in our party. She was a newscaster, very well known, and then she sort of discovered veganism, became very involved in animal rights and vegetarian issues, and when they asked her, would you, after 20 years of being a very, very well-known figure and beloved amongst the public, would like to join the political party, she said, yes, on one condition, I want to be the Minister of Environment. So when I joined the party, they said, Alon, we think you're great, but there's somebody even more famous than you who's running the environment. I said, great. And we became extremely close friends during the things, and we ran a campaign. And I just want to say how the campaign works. We had a lot of criticism. The Blue White campaign is vague, you're not out there, but in fact, it's a different world when you run a campaign today than it used to. And we felt we had to go to different sectors. So we had the environmental sector. We had polls that said that 15% of Israelis would vote for a party that was center left based on its environmental record. And so here's an example of the climate strike, something I think that you guys have seen here, which we participated in. Here's Nikki with young people. At every conceivable environmental event, we were there. There was strong, its campaigns we ran. It says, the animals who are in farms need, that's our symbol, need the blue and white party in the government. And the cats need the blue and white the chickens, and the stray dogs, okay? All these things, because there's a large community of Israelis that really like animals, okay? In the Arab sector, we had a campaign running largely on Facebook, where we managed to get, for example, I heard this morning, over half of the Druze votes, okay? That's 60,000 votes. We got over 30,000 votes in an Arab-speaking community, a community that we never had before. The Russian votes, there's a million Russian speakers in Israel. Ethiopian votes, we have 2 candidates in our 35 who are from Ethiopia. And so we felt this was a community of over 100,000 Israelis. So it was very sectorial, very focused how we ran this second round of campaign, each one trying to reach their kind of goal. But the other thing that happened at the end of it was the notion that we decided to have, to call for a unity secular government. In other words, we want to have a party without religious parties so that we can have, and this was something that Benny Gantz was not very happy about, but the poll said, you're running behind if you make this step and say, we're willing to have this, you'll manage to bring over some of the people like Lieberman and this and that, and so that was the last 2 or 3 weeks, and it proved to be a very effective campaign. So when you go into vote in Israel, you have all these different letters, because when Israel was established, many people were illiterate, and so this was ours, and this is what we found. This is me voting 2 days ago. You can see my shirt is inside out. You're not allowed to wear a political shirt inside the voting booth. So I turned it inside out and I went outside. This was at 7 in the morning, and I went and was responsible for about 30 different polling sites. Now, where are we this morning? And this is something which I had to change the slide twice because it's changing. Only 98%. Yeah, what's the number of been counted? 98%. But the last of the soldiers aren't in. But this is what it looks like the result is. We have a winner. 33 seats for the Blue and White Party. We went down, that's about 6% left, but we could went down more than 10% since the last election. And we see where, we now really look at the votes, it's across the board. Just about everywhere where they polled in April, they're down more than 10%. The big change, and we'll talk about this, the Arab list. In the last election, the Arabs voted 48% of the population, as opposed to 68% of the Jewish population. 2 days ago, that changed. And the Arab population, apparently in response, in anger, they're often very, very, I wouldn't say they're apathetic, they're not pathetic, but they're somewhat a little bit defeatist about their ability to influence policies because they're never included in the government. They decided, we are going to show this guy, if we get active, we can throw Netanyahu out, and that's apparently what is happening. And so if you look at the changes, that's what happened. Likud goes down, the joint list goes up, and Yisrael Beitenu, the same party that refused to be part of the coalition, Netanyahu was certain that he could pull the Russian voters away from that party and punish Lieberman for not creating a right-wing government. In this end, it was an increase. Okay, this is a second side of the graph. You can see the change that happened over the last summer. Several of the parties stayed the same, but on the whole, there's a slight shift to the center-left, and that seems to be enough to change the balance of power for the future. But that all depends on our president. Reuven Ruby Rivlin is Israel's president. The only two substantive authorities that the president has, I think my students already heard this from me in class. One, the president can pardon convicted criminals. And the second was the president decides which party has the better likelihood of forming a coalition. And that, when you have such close elections, turns out to be a very complicated decision. So in the last time in April, he looked at it, I think with a heavy heart, because he's got a belly full about Netanyahu. They're often at odds. But he said Netanyahu's the best one. I believe that when he starts meeting people on Sunday, very quickly they'll say, yep, blue and white, you have the opportunity. Here's an example of meeting with the Shas party during last April. Hearing their recommendations, he meets with all the parties. Who are you recommending to put together a document? So I'm going to pick about last minute in my talk to talk about some of the lessons that I think we learned in 2019 and the last 2 days in particular. The first one is that social media matters, okay? All the time my mother kept saying, where's your campaign? I don't see you guys. But my mother doesn't have a Facebook account. She doesn't have Twitter. She doesn't have Instagram. Mickey Chaimovich has 26,000 followers on Instagram. And she would put up a post and she said, we would go around and visit an environmental problem site, and she would make with her cell phone a movie of 2 minutes long, and we get 150,000 shares, okay? That's how campaigns are being run in Israel. It's very wired in, and it's, for me, it's an entirely new way of doing things. We stopped doing parlor meetings. It was a waste of time. Why be with 30 people when you have 150,000 viewers of your film? So that's one of the things that matters. Size matters. And this is something that we had a total of 4,329,000 votes, okay? Now, we have a law in Israel from the start of the country that there's a minimum threshold that you have. If you don't cross it, you can't be in the Knesset, and all your votes go to waste. Originally, that was 1%, but then it jumped to 2%. Several years ago, it went to 3.2%. That means if you don't come with, because my calculation, I hope I got it right, 117,000 votes, that's 3.25% of the 4 million. If you can't wield those votes, all the people voted for you wasted their votes. So much of the changing of the parties and mergers was an attempt by both sides, left and right, not to waste votes. The left did it better than the right. And that's why this party, the same Kahanist, right-wing, racist party, which was not accepted, I think to their credit, by the religious party, because they were sort of beyond the pale, they received only 1.8% of the vote, 81,000. That's 2 seats. If they had had those 2 seats, those voters had voted for the right wing, we'd have a little bit of a different picture today. Arabs matter. That's a big one. The Arab community has stepped forward and said, we want to be more influential, and I hope this is a permanent role, this sense of wanting to be involved. They are the story that have changed the dynamics since April, if you ask me. They got a total of 432,000 votes. That's a lot of votes, okay? 12 seats, now that's an old one, now it's up to 13 since I made the slides on the fly. Trump matters. The change in the political culture in Israel is palpable. Our party ran an anti-Trump campaign. In other words, our whole thing was, we don't want to demonize our opponents. We want to try to be above the fray. We want to be polite. We want to be precise, give real news. And we faced an opponent that looked at it somewhat differently in terms of their tactics. But there's no question that the politics that played out in the last election in the United States and the style of the American president affects politics around the world. The last thing is, Israel's traditionally been a left-right split. In this election, just like April, the left hardly mattered. All 11 seats between the two leftist parties, not such a big one. Unity matters. Here we have an example of the possible unity government. We're talking about bringing in a Likud and blue and white together without Netanyahu. That's what we're calling for. The Prime Minister needs to step down, and that is going to be the issue that's determined. If you look at the number of supporters, 98% of our supporters favor a unity government, 55% of Likud, just to give you a sense of how that goes. But Israel Leighton is calling the shots, and then 84%. And it looks like, if you ask my prediction, we will have a unity government. But if you look at the numbers there, women don't seem to matter. We've seen I think, an unfortunate step backward for gender equality in Israeli politics. And as somebody who's working very closely with a woman candidate, I think that's something we have to work very hard on. Hopefully, campaign promises to give equal roles to women in the cabinet will be met. Lieberman matters. This is this Yisrael Beitenu party, 8 votes. Right now we're at a slight lead for the leftist side, but this man will decide whether he's going to throw in his votes with the leftist side of the party or the right, and all of a sudden we have a new kingmaker, something we didn't have in the past. And last and finally, democracy matters. This is a picture with my daughter from 10 years ago, when I was voting. Hey, that was the Green Party of Israel, and we're out there voting, and we actually got 1.3%, but the threshold then was 2%, we didn't get in, okay? this was her voting. This is a 102-year-old man who voted at the Knesset in Ramat Aviv on Tuesday. Here's a picture of him, I think, back here with Ben Gurion. And it's amazing that we had a whole series of fans bringing the retired elderly community of Ramat Aviv to come vote for blue and white. It was amazing. Here's a picture of my daughter today. I told my students I would show a picture of her. She's 19 years old. She's a combat soldier in the Barden Lasser cheating unit. And here she is voting, not for my party, because she's always been on the left. Yesterday or 2 days ago, she sent to me, sorry, Dad, I'm voting for the leftist liberal Meretz party. And I couldn't be prouder. But the point that I want to close is that it's an amazing thing to me today to feel that indeed we live in a country where it's still a very robust democracy. And the people of Israel, who were not happy going to a second election, have seemed to have made their statement and said, we want a new government. So I'm going to leave it at that, and Yael, take it from there.
You did in the campaigning, and it was amazing, I think, to get a first-hand point of view from someone who's on the ground. And for you students out there, you can see why we keep bringing him back, because he's such a fantastic lecturer. So I'm going to try, because I want to leave time for discussion, to maybe just take about 15 minutes or so and elaborate on certain things, give a little more context, and then open it up to questions. So in terms of context, for those of you who are not as familiar with Israeli politics, and probably many of the students here are not, Israel is an extremely polarized society. We can see our own American society getting more and more polarized. It seems like each year, and elections being very close. And in Israel, this has been the case for quite a while. So my dad is here, and he wrote a book, Israeli Visions and Divisions, right, about Israeli polarization in the 80s, right, I think it was. And so for decades now, it's polarized in many ways, but you get these very often, many of the elections, very close elections, and therefore you often don't know, and we still don't completely know for sure what's going to happen and what government we have, because it's so extremely polarized in many ways. You do have this sense that in a lot of commentaries about Israel that politically it's moving to the right. And of course we've seen that with Netanyahu being in power for the past 10 years, that supports that notion. On the other hand, you could also make the argument that the center has often been very active, and from 2005 to 2013, maybe you could argue that the center was to some extent in power. And of course, Tzipi Livni in 2009 of a Center Kadima party actually won the most votes and wasn't able to form the coalition. I don't think that'll happen to Gantz, but that's always the fear, right? That just because you didn't get the most amount of votes, you get, at least in what I've been reading in the last 40 hours, you hear some murmuring of some Likud members saying, oh, let Gantz have the chance first, he won't be able to do it, and then we'll be able to do it, or something like that. That's a bad gamble probably to take. But the point is, it's very close, you don't know the results yet. And the center, on one hand, you can see this as a return of the center, possibly, after a 10-year Netanyahu rule. On the other hand, the center has often been there and been part of those coalition governments, so it's another way to think of it. Also, when people talk about a rightward shift in Israeli politics, to some extent that's true, again with the Netanyahu government. On the other hand, arguably, some of the right parties have adopted some of the positions of what used to be the center left and have moved to the center and created center parties. So you have simultaneously, perhaps, a shift to the right, but some of the right shifting to the center, right? And this is, again, when you hear the Gantz party and the makeup of the Gantz party, where you have people who are more pragmatic, perhaps like Gantz, especially on the Israeli-Palestinian issue. I think that because you have these stable blocks in the left center and right center, in the past few elections, one way to look at it, and that's one thing I mentioned in April, is you get more of a shift within a center left block and a shift within a center right block than you do shifts among the blocks, right? And therefore, these 1 or 2 seats can really matter, right, in terms of who's able to form the government, but you don't see in each of these elections often a dramatic shift from, oh, it's really moved rightward or it's really moved leftward in terms of the amount of votes that each of the blocks has. You see more shifts within it, and even here, you might see differences of 2 or 3 or 4 seats that make the difference in terms of who can form a coalition. But it's not this dramatic shift between blocs. But this is where I get back to Gantz, because the blocs are so stable. One of the only ways, arguably, and this is what I was saying in April, that the blue and white party can gain more votes is if they get some votes from that right bloc. So I think, and maybe Alon can speak to this later in the discussion, that Gantz is a little more pragmatic than maybe even some of his rhetoric during the election, saying, well, I don't know about 2 states, and I don't know about certain things. Whereas if you listen to his lectures that he's given before he ran for election, I think in some of the think tanks in Washington, D.C., again, he's not Meretz in terms of the urgency of peace negotiations now, but he's, I think, far more pragmatic than Netanyahu. So that's kind of one thing in the background in terms of these blocs that I wanted to leave out there. One question that I raised in April was, why hasn't the center left been able to be more successfully challenge Netanyahu, especially since he's been in trouble in the past year? And arguably one reason is the lack of ideological clarity and cooptation of the right of some of the positions in the center. One reason is the stagnation of the peace process, which Netanyahu certainly contributed to, arguably over the last 10 years. Continuing violence, often in many countries and in Israel as well, will favor the right if people are feeling insecure. Mistakes made on the part of the center-left leadership. So even if you look at the current relative victory of the center-left bloc, it could have been an even larger margin, leading to perhaps greater bargaining power and greater security in forming this coalition. And what hindered that? Where perhaps, again, you get, in terms of these left parties, new leaders. They didn't do that well in April, so Gabay of Labor is out, someone new is in, etc. New coalitions, right? So Barak joins Meretz. Ehud Barak was the former prime minister. Meretz is the leftmost Zionist party in Israel. But in the last few months, he got caught up in Epstein and whether Epstein indirectly, one of his affiliates, had funded something that Barak benefited from, and that weakened him. So you have this fluctuating leadership and disunified leadership among the center-left. Peretz, which was the new kind of labor leader after Gabay, again, because Labor Party didn't do that well in April, you get someone new, but it seems like he was kind of flirting of perhaps joining a Netanyahu government, right? And so that kind of weakened perhaps his support as well, because if you look, the blue and white party did really well, but these smaller parties left of him, as Professor Lantal said, didn't do as well as one might have imagined. I mentioned in April gender in Israeli political culture. Professor Lantal, we see that, in the blue and white leaders, Likud parties, they're all men. However, and Tzipi Livni, when she won the most votes, perhaps there was a gender issue there. When there were women leaders of parties, we can talk about that, how that affects things. On the other hand, there's not a dramatic change there when you look at Knesset membership. I think maybe female Knesset members will go down from like 29 to 28 or something like that if there's a new, so things are bad, but they're not significantly worse in terms of Knesset membership. There is, I still think, and I mentioned this, there's a lagging perception that the center-left is more Ashkenazi or Jews from European descent rather than Mizrahi Jews from Middle Eastern and Sephardic descent, and that's not always true in terms of the last two leaders of the Labor Party or in terms of who actually is voting, but there's still that lagging perception and some gaps that contribute to it. And then, of course, you have the difficulty of the left not being able to really align itself completely with these four predominantly Arab Israeli parties, right? One of them, Hadash, also has Jewish representatives and Jewish support, and actually some Jews voted for the whole joint list, Arab list, for a variety of reasons, right? But they've never been, as Professor Lantal said, invited in a coalition government. And if you ask why not, there are several reasons for that. There, on one hand, could be prejudice on the part of Jewish parties against them. There also can be sometimes that they refuse to be part of the coalition. And so when you had the Hadash, the Communist Party, who's heading the joint list, a member saying, I might join a coalition with the Blue and White Party if Blue and White wins. He got a lot of flack from other parties in the coalition that includes more nationalist parties or Islamist parties that would reject perhaps going part of the election, so sometimes they themselves don't want a form of coalition. And then you have also the issue that one of the parties is perceived sometimes, or a couple of its leaders perceived sometimes as backing enemies of Israel, so to speak, and they have a harder time being brought into coalition. But it'd be interesting to see if there's any possibility now of that happening, and alternatively, if they're not brought into coalition, which is still unlikely, whether they will actually lead the opposition, which would be a new, interesting role for them. So Professor Alon Tal started thinking about, well, what happened since April, right? Why was it that you had kind of an almost equal vote between Likud and Blue and White in April, but it seemed like he could then garner 60 members to form a coalition. Then what happened since April, right? And Alon Tal talked about some of those things. One of the things that happened is one of the center-right parties, Kulanu, joined Likud. And maybe that could have affected things in perhaps losing support for the bloc as a whole, again, shifts within the bloc as opposed to gaining things for the bloc. The Lieberman factor, which Alon Tal quickly mentioned, but his gamble paid off of not joining the coalition in April, making a big deal about rejecting ultra-Orthodox parties in the coalition government. And it seems like his party's mandate and the Blue and White Party's mandate on religious issues is quite similar. So they both want the civil marriage opportunity in Israel, which Israel doesn't currently have, more civil marriage plots for burials, more freedom in terms of transportation and markets and so forth on the Sabbath or Saturday, right? So they both have kind of a secular agenda that they're pushing, and Lieberman was very much able to make something out of that and make the difference, and perhaps steal some votes from the right bloc on that. Even in 1 or 2 votes would have made a difference here. Netanyahu, of course, was also in a weakened position after April, right? Because here you have, despite all the positives that Alon Tal outlined as to why you have a quarter of the population voting for him, and even remember in this parliamentary system how much support Netanyahu has actually gotten in the past 10 years, the past few elections, it's often a quarter of the vote, or maximum 30% of the vote, right? Because you have 10 parties competing each other. So I think sometimes students in America, think that, oh, he got the majority of the vote. He's never gotten the majority of the vote, right? He gets between a quarter to 30% of the vote. So the question is, nevertheless, why did it go down? And one of the reasons is the fact that he wasn't able to build a coalition in April, right, meant that he looked weak, right? He should have been able to do it. He didn't do it. The perception within his party and with other parties and with people who are voting is that he was weakened, right? He also basically is supposed to go to trial 2 weeks from now, in a pre-indictment trial. That probably, contributed to it. He's seen to some extent as this Mr. Security among his supporters in Israel, yet you had all these tensions coming about with Lebanon, with Iran, with Gaza, which weakened that. And in addition to that, thinking of psychology, he's a pretty risk-averse person, right? And that helps explain why, one of the many reasons, he's been so reluctant to really seriously engage in peace negotiations, because he sees risks in his mind of peace. He's also been reluctant to get into wars or prolonged wars. And this was very unusual for him, that despite his kind of innate risk aversion, about last week, he was going to go to war with Gaza, right? Without sufficiently consulting or getting the approval of his military people or his cabinet, right? And so then Alon Tal was talking about how Mendel, the Attorney General, has actually played a positive role. And here too, he said, look, as well as the military and the Attorney General said, you're doing this for political reasons. You usually want to show constraint and are reluctant to have a kind of a serious engagement in Gaza. You're doing this to delay the elections and to alter the political field, and they stopped it from doing that. People are aware of that as well. I think the fact, as Alon Tal mentioned, his continued incitement against Arab Israelis and their relatively poor showing in April galvanized them to come out more, so it backfired on him. these kind of tactics that he was using, which brought more votes, as Antal said, to the center left. And also he continually was threatening democratic institutions like the Supreme Court. That may have backfired. And also you see, if one of the things that his supporters liked was the fact that he could talk about his good relations with some world leaders around the world, well, even that, which really helped him in the last 2 weeks before the April election, as I talked about in April, was pretty much gone or much weaker this time, right? If you recall in April, Trump was giving him like 3 gifts in the 3 weeks beforehand, with making the Revolutionary Guard in Iran on the terrorist list. He gave him the Golan, recognition of the Golan before that. He brought him to the White House and shook his hand the day before. He was, visibly kind of saying people should vote for Netanyahu. And Putin, right, just a few days before the April election did the same thing for Netanyahu, right? He basically, that missing soldier for decades, an Israeli soldier, was found in Syria, which is fantastic. But the ritual and ceremony of how that was brought out right before the election was to help Netanyahu in the next election. See, Netanyahu brought home this soldier because of his relationship with Putin and Russia's influence in Syria right before the election. This time, what did Trump and Putin do? Perhaps because they saw a weakened Netanyahu who could not form a coalition in April and were hedging their bets, perhaps. But Putin made Netanyahu wait for 3 hours before meeting him this week, and then Netanyahu, in his panic of wanting, since you can only mainly get votes from within your own bloc, trying to get votes from even parties to the right of him, was talking about annexing now parts of the West Bank and the Jordan Valley. And he was trying to get Putin sanctions for that, and Putin said, sorry, that's against international law, I'm not backing you on this, right? So he didn't give Netanyahu anything right before the election. And of course, Netanyahu was trying to get something from Trump right beforehand to show the Israeli public the same way he did in April, look what Trump will do for me. And in fact, the opposite in some ways was happening, right? Trump was reaching out to Rouhani against Netanyahu's wishes, and probably many Israeli skepticism of that. And Netanyahu was asking for a defense pact with the United States. And Trump did not say, yes, we're going to do that to help Netanyahu right before the election. He kind of tweeted, yeah, well, maybe, let's talk about it afterwards, kind of thing. So again, in a highly polarized society in which elections are so close, and hinge on, whether someone gets 1 or 2 more seats than their rival, all these things together can really make the difference. So I'm going to kind of throw out there, to some extent, as I did in April, whether this portends perhaps a greater long-term rather than the short-term weakening of the Likud party. And like Alon Tal was saying, a lot of people who've been voting for Likud, part of it was despite Netanyahu in some respects, but a lot of it was because of Netanyahu in the sense that no one could remember anything else. They thought, who else can do it? He has the experience, he's been doing it for so long. He knows all the leaders around the world. And now that he seems to be going down and in greater danger of perhaps going to jail, that could have longer weakening effects perhaps on the Likud. Now, I'm just going to quickly go through possible coalition governments and the impact they could have on different issues and how we might look at it. So on one hand, in this polarized society, in many of the coalition governments, arguably, you're not going to see a direct, obvious, dramatic change in certain issue areas. And perhaps institutionally, given the polarized society that Israel has and the parliamentary system that's often dependent on these smaller parties, it makes it harder to have dramatic, let's say, foreign policy change or other change, institutionally speaking. And again, we see this close election and we wonder, on one hand, can we celebrate for those, who think Netanyahu's done a lot of damage on the peace front, or in terms of challenging democratic institutions like the media or the high courts, etc. But on the other hand, there's not this sense of elation for those who want dramatic change either, because you might argue with any of these potential coalition governments, and especially with one that might still include the Likud even without Netanyahu. And again, that's going to be very hard because Netanyahu is fighting for his life, and we could talk about those different scenarios where Gantz says, well, I either have to be prime minister, or if there's a rotation in unity government, I should go first, right? There was one example of rotation with Paris in the 80s, 1980s, but basically, if Netanyahu waits to be rotated second as prime minister in a unity government, he might be in jail by then, right? Because if he's not prime minister, he can be indicted and he can go to jail if he's not prime minister. So he can't afford, and probably won't agree, to a unity government without him, because then he could go to jail, or to unity government where Gantz becomes prime minister first, because he could go to jail. But nevertheless, let's say we get a coalition government without Likud and without Netanyahu. You're, again, not going to see this dramatic shift, perhaps, on the peace front. But what I think the minimum you can see, and I'm an eternal optimist, and the older I get, the harder it is to be optimistic, but what you could see, at a minimum, you're staving off things getting dramatically worse, which may have happened with a different, worse in what respect? Worse in terms of the strength of Israeli democracy, if he was going to challenge the checks and balances even more in terms of the high court, right, on one hand, or the real polarization in terms of different sectors of the society, and Jews and non-Jews in the society. But also on the peace front, I mean, I think I may have been just bluster his talk about annexation and election ploy, annexing further parts of the West Bank, election ploy before he comes to power, but who knows, he may have tried to embark on these annexations had he had another right-wing government and had the mandate to do so. So at a minimum, right, this is definitely a very weakened Netanyahu with a good possibility he may not be survived. And at a minimum, it's kind of staving things from getting a lot worse in terms of Israeli democracy, or for those of us who'd like to see a peaceful resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. On the other hand, you could have more change, to see the glass half full, that may be less bleak than just maintaining the status quo, right? On one hand, if you just have the status quo and things don't get worse, it still could be bleak, because I don't believe there is a status quo. Things are either getting better or worse, let's say on the Israeli-Palestinian front. So even if you maintain a status quo and don't do things directly, formally to make things worse, a status quo in itself is making things worse, arguably, because things aren't static over time. And that's something to be really concerned about. On the more optimistic side, right, I think there is more maneuvering room to do, as Alon Tal said, which is not the platform that Rabin had in 1992, we're going to make peace within a year with the Palestinians, and not the platform of Barak in 2000, where he won by, in Israeli standards, a landslide on the platform of urgently getting to peace with the Palestinians also within a year or two. We don't have that now. But on the other hand, things could be moving positively in the direction of keeping a two-state solution still alive. And there are measures that perhaps even in a unity government, depending on the coalition that Gantz could be part of, because I think even though he's more cautious, his heart or his ideology is more open to leaving that two-state solution open. You could see things. And there are things that Gantz has practically written, I believe, that are part of the Israeli think tank affiliated with Tel Aviv University, INSSS, that did a whole report on kind of how you can move things pragmatically and constructively in a positive direction on the Israeli-Palestinian front, even if you're not kind of going to a peace summit this year, as Barak wanted to do in Camp David. And those things include expanding Palestinian authorities in Area C, economic development in Area C, doing things about prisoners. I mean, there are all kinds of practical things that they lay out. They can be constructively done to keep things from deteriorating, to keep them from a status quo that keeps deteriorating, and move things in a more positive direction. Now, one thing, and I guess we're all professors and talk too long, so I'll try to close there. There's a possibility of more significant change, perhaps, as Professor Tal was suggesting, internally on religious secular issues, right? So often the argument in Israel has been, to varying extents, we can't deal with our internal cleavages, economic and social cleavages in terms of Jews and Arabs in Israel because we have an external security conflict that we have to worry about. We can't deal with messing with the status quo in terms of religion and the space for religion in the country because we're dealing with an external conflict. But now that there's not much movement in resolving the external conflict, the last few elections have looked inward on it in terms of domestic issues. And so it could very well be that you have significant change, right, depending on the coalition, on these issues where you get civil marriage, where you get civil burial, where you get movement in the right direction that could diffuse tensions in Israel, unify to some extent. Most of the Israelis say they're for these things, by the way, that would change to some extent the nature of the role of religion, and it could repair perhaps some of the potential long-term damage in U.S.-Israeli relations that have been undermined by making Israel a more partisan issue recently, right? And so therefore, if you have kind of more religious space and pluralism in Israel, and if you have someone other than Netanyahu who's more pragmatic being prime minister and who's able to also not be as partisan in American politics, there's directions and change both internally to Israel that might have an impact on U.S.-Israeli relations. So there are also a bunch of different coalitions that are possible, even though they might be likely, that we could go through. And one includes kind of some of the center-left parties, blue-white, Likud and Lieberman's Israel Beitenu party, right, that could move things in a more secular, it's probably too simplistic way of putting it, but a more secular direction on one hand. On the other hand, it's probably not likely, but you throw out there, could they actually, instead of aligning with Likud without Netanyahu, align with ultra-Orthodox parties? Now, of course, rhetorically, they've all been against it, but there have been murmurs within the United Torah Judaism Party, the ultra-Orthodox Ashkenazi party, that some of its members would contemplate doing that. It's kind of an interesting thing to think about, whether then you'd have less change in terms of religion domestically, but what impact, if any, it might have externally in terms of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict if it was ultra-Orthodox there instead of Likud. Could there be room? It's kind of an interesting thing to play with. But all right, so we've all talked too much. Come over here and please give us your questions, critiques, things you're confused about, scenarios you want to run. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just wondering with the blue and white party if there's going to be any like incentives for like getting more women involved and having like the women vote matter more. Curious on your thoughts on that.
So I actually, after the election, I met with Benny Gantz. I thought I'd see him for 10 minutes. We talked for an hour. He was in the opposition then. He had more time than I expected. And I said, you have to do two things in the next election to do better. One, you have to make an Arab candidate on the list, because I think a lot of Arabs would vote for a centrist party, and they would reject the notion of having a narrow Arab party, and you have to really do something about the women. Now, what happened in the blue and white party was, because of these mergers of parties, and all the parties were headed by men, you had to give special place to men. And in addition, when you're a center party and you're competing with Netanyahu, you've got to send a message to Israelis. We understand security. And so we realized early on that we have 3 former heads of the Israeli army together. They have over 100 years of military experience, okay? And so, but this wasn't something that was premeditated. It was sort of circumstances. And Benny said on many, many interviews, I think it's unfortunate that we have to do more. When I appoint ministers in my cabinet, I'll make up the difference. So I'm very hopeful that that will indeed be the case, and that there'll be at least a bit of balance, 40% women ministers or something like that. I'm certain that in the next round there will be changes made in this regard, but it has been a constant weak spot. When I go around and talk to people and ask this question, I can only agree and say, at least, and this is one of the big differences between maybe Gantz personality and Netanyahu, rather than trying to be, rejected outright, Gantz acknowledged this is a problem, we have to change it. That's the best way I can do.
What's the only party led by a woman right now, actually? Yep, Yamina, the right party, right?
Not only that,
Yeah,
it's far-right religious party
Led by a secular
secular
woman.
woman.
So there is one right now, woman
Her
leader of a
future,
party.
as of yesterday, seems very unclear
Yeah.
because it's going to break in half, and the religious people expected a lot of secular people to vote for them, and they didn't vote for them. I think that she didn't deliver the goods, and so I think her future is ahead of parties.
Good.
Why don't we go?
Great to see this, lots of questions.
I'm glad I got all
Yeah.
my students here. We got to get that chance.
So when you're voting, at least here, you know who you're gonna vote for, and you just vote for your party, and that's what most people do, is they just vote for party and leave. But you have like the option to choose who you vote for. When you vote in Israel, do you just put in the party and then the party decides who's gonna be what
That's exactly
from there? And like how do they decide that? Is it just the one person at the head of the party, or does the party like come together and vote some way?
That's a good question. So, you want to talk about primaries, or do you want to?
I mean, different parties do it differently in terms of, it used to be more parties had kind of secret kind of selections of lists, then it's opened up and become more democratic, and my dad wrote about that too, so there's the Labor Party and other parties. So it's done differently, but usually you know like the top, let's say 5 people. Let's say people when they vote for blue and white won't know necessarily who's number 30 that's gonna get in there, but they'll know the top 4 people, so in that sense they know who they're voting for, even though they're technically not voting for them. But the parties themselves, like you said, then organize who's on the list and what ranking they are.
What happened was, in many parties, particularly Likud, the open, I think, admirable primary system turned out to be a opportunity for sort of far-wing extremists to take over the party. Because what happens, I can join the Likud party if I'm a right-winger. I can make sure that the candidates in Likud are very right-wing and then not even vote for them. And that's what they find, that the settlers in the West Bank are very high percentage of Likud members. And so if you're a Likud politician, you have to pander to that right thing. So when the Yesh Atid party was started, our party was started, they didn't want to be subject to any kind of blackmail. And so they said, right now, we're going to appoint them, and the public will decide. If you don't like them, you don't have to vote for us. But I think by my selecting according to my criteria, we're going to have very good people. I think it proved itself, and the proof of the pudding is, there were 35 members of this brand new blue and white party, none of them democratically elected, all appointed, okay? Now, it was a deadlock in April, 60-60, and all 35 of them were approached very quietly, said, you know, if you join our party, leave the blue and white party, we'll make you a minister, make you very famous. All 35 of them said, we don't do that, we have integrity. That's quite remarkable, when you can turn something down, they'd rather be an anonymous member of Knesset. So, but there is a bit of tension about that.
Oh yeah, I have a pretty hard question. So
Then Yael should be answering.
so is Lieberman more likely to sit in a government with the joint list and the center left alongside blue and white, or Netanyahu and the Orthodox parties who just spent the entire election in
You sound like an Israeli newspaper, but it's exactly what asked at every opportunity. Lieberman is trying to force Netanyahu out of the head of the Likud party. It's clear. He has already said he's not going to be part of a narrow, and he proved it. He had the chance to be Minister of Defense in the last, a very, very important job in the last Netanyahu coalition. He said, no, I don't want that. Israel doesn't need more governments with extremist religious people driving the agenda. Only government I'll join will. Now, whether that means that he would, in order to put the Likud's feet to the fire, would actually join a coalition supported by Arabs, that is the million-dollar question. The Likud are gambling no. He could never do it through political suicide, and therefore, at the end of the day, he's going to have to come back. I think at the end of the day, Netanyahu's his strategy is to go for a third election. He's not happy. Still.
And of course, if you just look at precedent, Lieberman, it would be hard for him to backtrack on his main agenda being a secular government. But in the past, he's been in governments with ultra-Orthodox parties. He hasn't with Arab parties. Which does he have greater distaste for? I don't know. He's sometimes has racist rhetoric. although he's formally for two-state, he's for kind of in land swaps, having Israeli Arabs move to the Palestinian state. So he has his issues in that area, although has more pragmatism than some. But on the other hand, he ran on kind of a secular agenda. So it's unlikely he would try to do neither. But it's an interesting question that you posed.
He's got a huge amount.
Ben?
So we didn't talk. We talked a bit about the Joint Arab Party. That being the third largest party.
It went up
currently
30%.
is insane.
That's a huge jump to go 30%.
So where do we see them playing in this next government? Do we see them being the lead in the opposition? Having a say at the table for defense, or do we see them actually joining the government?
So I think that the party itself, remember, is four parties. There are four Arab parties who joined together so that none of them would fall below the threshold. And they are very, very different in their perspectives. It's clear that the largest and the most oldest, the communist side of the communist in sort of the modern sense of the word, Chadash, the chairman of its party, Ayman Uda, who's a lawyer from Haifa, wants very much to get out of the role and to be an opposition. He would love to be part of the cabinet. It's clear. There was a big 3-page interview with him in Israel's largest newspaper, Yediot, 3 weeks ago, and he talked about it. But I'm tired of standing outside of being irrelevant. My constituents have real problems. I need to be more influential. And he heard that, and it seems to work. That is what brought more people out, because in the past they said, why should we vote for the Arabs? All they care about is the Palestinian issues. All they want to do is yell at they don't influence them. So I think there is that desire to do that. But when you have Islamic elements, so I'm not sure that party's going to hold together, and maybe that some parts of it become more conciliatory. I will say this, that we said all along in the whole election we could not go have them join our cabinet because they're anti-Zionist, don't believe in a Jewish and democratic state. But we are committed to having an Arab minister. And that might be one of the agreements. But when there was a big demonstration in Tel Aviv before there was a new elections called to protect the integrity of the Supreme Court, and there were many people who did not want him to speak there. Benny Gantz waited and said, the Arabs have to come out and vote. And he said this was a big moment for him. He felt it was very important. And the second phone call that Benny Gantz made after the election was to him. So I think that bodes well.
And so I would say it's unlikely but possible that his party would depart from that joint list to join a coalition. Unlikely, but it's a kind of an interesting hypothetical to think about. It could be that it's the first time that an Arab party leads the opposition, which is very possible, and then they get the security and intelligence briefings
And they get to meet with foreign leaders, and there's a chance they're really broad.
And have a more of a world presence, which could make a difference. So interestingly enough, there's always been a ceiling in a way to Palestinian Jews and Bedouin kind of power in Israeli politics in terms of them never either wanting to or being invited to or both into a coalition government. But on the other hand, they've had tremendous influence. This is not the first time they have it on who's going to be prime minister in Israel, right? So they were going to vote for Peres, Shimon Peres in 1996, and then because of his, going into Lebanon and having this mistaken, flawed thing, where 100 or civilians were killed in the UN thing, it was a mistake, but nevertheless, he was responsible for it. They said, okay, we're going to boycott the elections, and it helped Netanyahu win very, very narrowly to be prime minister in 1996 and that's just one of several examples. When they decide to vote in numbers or not vote in numbers has historically often determined who's going to be the prime minister. So that's a huge power in some ways that they sometimes choose to exercise or choose not to, indirectly or directly, and this time chose directly to. And if Netanyahu goes to jail, they play a bigger role.
And every time they're being interviewed, they always say Bibi Netanyahu was the most negative, flagrant anti-Arab rhetoric. Fan the fires of hatred. We need to see him go down. There's a visceral dislike of this particular prime minister.
There's just a question. I see he was exploiting with Putin and Trump. I'm surprised Bibi hasn't done anything with Brazil. Since remember Jair Bolsonaro, he like moved, also recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, and that's how.
He said he announced his intention. When he came to Israel also, another example. I suggest we have a campaign, tell me who your friends are, I'll tell you who you are, because all these terrible despots are secret friends of the people. When he came, the Israeli environmental movement set up demonstrations because of what's going on in the Amazon. Yeah, he joins a long list of powerful world leaders that Netanyahu has cozied up to.
Often populist nationalists, leaders.
Okay, so how do you think about like
Speak up, though, I can't hear you.
do I need a louder? Okay, so how do you think like the polarization and the tendency of right wing, the tendency of right wing in states politics, and how do you think like this will affect like the relations between Israel and Arabic countries in the future?
Well, the polarization in Israel, is that what you're saying, how that will affect it? Well, I mean, it's kind of interesting. You have three things I think going on in terms of Israel's relations with other Arab countries. One is, interestingly enough, even under the Netanyahu government, in some ways relations have recently improved with the Egyptian government and the Israeli government in terms of cooperation, intelligence, military operation, a lot of cooperation, Gaza, in terms of Egypt playing a role in trying to uphold ceasefires and keep ceasefires. You have greater relations with Saudi Arabia and some of the other Gulf countries, partially because they see a common threat from Iran. So on one hand, you see this growing common interests among these countries. On the other hand, there's also a limit to how much closer those relationships necessarily can get without having resolved the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, right? So Saudi Arabia in 2002 came up with its own peace initiative. It's preferred again and again by the Arab League, and again in 2013 that they support. Most of these countries, of course, don't have diplomatic relations with Israel other than its neighbors Egypt and Jordan through peace treaties. And so they have a lot of growing relations, but it's not normal, recognized diplomatic relations. And so many of these governments say they will move to having normal relations until there is an Israeli-Palestinian peace agreement, with Israel going back to 67 borders with lands based on 67 borders with land swaps, right? That's what Secretary Kerry got the Arab League to do in 2013, so it's not 67 border, but based on 67 border with land swaps, and a just and agreed solution to Palestinian refugees, right? Just is for Palestinian interests, agreed to is for Israeli interests, right? So it has to be just but agreed to by Israel, which means not full Palestinian return if Israel's going to agree to it. So in some ways, it's kind of a pragmatic set of principles that are out there that could be used in the future, so there's growing relations, but also limits to those relations. Meanwhile, next to, I hate to put women on the spot to do this, but it's only men that are asking questions. Here we're talking about like gender and Israeli politics, and let's go, women. Okay, go ahead. Sorry.
So do you see Israel splitting up, like giving some land to Palestine, even with like Israeli citizens moving into East Jerusalem and the West Bank and just taking some of that territory? Or do you think Israel's gonna keep all the land?
Could you repeat that?
Do you see Israel
Making
splitting
territorial
up?
concessions or not?
What?
Do you think Israel? So I think that's one of the significance of what happened this week on Tuesday. I think under a Netanyahu right-wing government of 61 votes, there would have been absolutely no room in a group like that to make territorial concessions. Now, one of the things that hovered around these elections was the so-called deal of the century that President Trump has been announcing. He's going to announce immediately after the elections, which calls for land swaps, which calls for Israel to leave much of the, we don't know exactly, I haven't seen the maps, but it's basically, we know what these maps look like. It means that most of the land in the West Bank will have to be part of the Palestinian state, and that some Jewish settlements will be dismantled and some Jewish settlements will remain there, okay? And there'll be some kind of a thing. And one of the arguments that the right-wing parties, the Yamina party that was mentioned here, was we need to be a very powerful party. Give us your votes, because otherwise Netanyahu will make territorial concessions, because he's agreed in the past, and he's very weak on this, and we can't give back a centimeter of land in the West Bank, which is ours, in terms of our historical or strategic needs. So I think that a unity government between Likud and Blue and White would be much more open towards giving a shot at this kind of an agreement. That's my.
And just as a quick add-on to that, of course, even though support for a two-state solution among Israelis and Palestinians has gone down in recent years because of that stagnation of the peace process, relatively to other solutions, it's still significantly higher than alternative solutions in terms of where the publics are, and of course where the international leaders are, despite Trump's sometimes waffling on two states versus one states. Putin came out today, I think, saying it has to be two states. We now want a government that leaves that option over. And so the whole international community is still kind of behind that. And Greenblatt, although he said he was going to leave the peace process alone, is in Israel now, wanting to talk to Gantz and Netanyahu, and now is saying, no, maybe I'll stick with some kind of peace. So we're kind of skeptical what that is, and they've lost the trust of the Palestinian Authority. But there may be some room. What I'm saying is, the publics themselves and the international leaders are still relatively more for trying to push a two-state solution, which also will put the brakes on those who are interested in obstructing that in some ways. Did I see a hand here? Okay.
Yeah, so many questions, but first the corruption accusations. How persuasive were they, and were people really angry about it, or was it more like, for also in view of what President Trump has been doing, if I may say so, is this really a big deal? And should a leader with 10 years of experience really be imprisoned for what he did?
So this really depends on where you stand politically. A typical Likud supporter would say the Israeli left couldn't beat him at the polls, and so they put undue pressure on the Attorney General. They obfuscated the police, and these are ridiculous charges. He didn't put a penny in his pocket. The fact that you're making a deal for better political coverage, all politicians do it all the time. He's been singled out, and there's absolutely nothing behind these charges. Somebody like myself who doesn't come from that perspective would say, we have a situation there where they say that absolute power corrupts absolutely. What we have here is a prime minister who's been very cavalier about observing the law and did cross the line on several occasions. Now there's a fourth case, which has recently been, which is by far, if it turns into anything, would be most severe, which was that Netanyahu agreed to buy at an extremely high price German submarines because his family members own stock in the company and this kind of thing, and it was and there's a lot of people, because he bought these submarines against the advice of all the defense establishment. Why would he do that? But the truth of the matter is, speaking as an Israeli also, I would say, look, we have sent a president to jail because he raped his secretary, okay? And we sent a prime minister to jail because he took $150,000 when he was the mayor of Jerusalem and put it in his pocket. Those were serious offenses that obviously had to go. I would not be heartbroken if our president, in order to make this deal go down, said to Netanyahu, I will give you a pardon even in advance of what has happened in the past. Because although they are, I think, if you read the 45 pages of the Attorney General, which describes what happened there, you just, how could, this is outrageous that somebody could be that cavalier with the law. It's still not the kind of corruption which I think is heinous, that is unforgivable. He acted inappropriately, he should leave office.
The only thing I would add to that, and that's true, is that there has been a shift, I think, in Israeli society and politics, where it used to be the country wasn't as wealthy, it had socialist roots. If you look at the former prime ministers, they lived extremely modestly. They were not wealthy. They didn't have phones sometimes, and didn't have other things. And then in the 1970s, Yitzhak Rabin resigned because his wife had an account of $2,000 in the United States that was illegal. So he voluntarily, that was the culture then. He voluntarily resigned because of $2,000 that his wife had an account here. Not that they had done anything corrupt, but that, And now you see a much wealthier country, a more capitalist country. There's much more, the politics, it's still nowhere near what it is in the United States in terms of money and politics, but it's becoming more Americanized in the sense of the wealth of some of the politicians, the money that goes into elections, and I think that feeds into perhaps the last, a greater political culture where you see more of this coming up than you used to 30 years ago. But I think there's still, among many Israelis, a real distaste for that. And
I think that was part of Gantz's appeal, is that he's somebody who's old school. He's, he's not a wealthy man, and he spent his whole life being a soldier.
I'm part of the Men of Peace team, which is an organization that teaches the skills of active nonviolence, and they place peace teams domestically, but have often sent peace teams to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And the stories that they bring home are of very frank racism towards, and pretty much sometimes very severe terrorist acts towards the Palestinian people. And I'm wondering how much that has changed, or if that's moving in a different direction. Often it's imparted on the Palestinians by the Israeli police. And what is the Blue and White Party, what is their platform, if you will, to help the Palestinian people and to make it a better playing ground so that the two different factions of people can work together and live together?
So that could go with a gun and rifle is now patrolling between Nablus and Qalqilia back and forth, and doing the kind of things that you have to do when you occupy people who don't want to be occupied. It's very distasteful work. And she waited, counted the days till she turned 17. You can join the political party when you're 17, so she could join the Meretz Party, which is very much against the occupation. So I get a very up-to-date, I spent much time as a soldier. The truth of the matter is that for the most part, I think she says there's nothing that we do which is a war crime, and yet a lot of what we do is distasteful. It's not, you're imposing, but her first time she went in to arrest somebody, they found his cell phone. They pulled the family up and found his cell phone, and he was planning a terrorist attack. So it's a hard thing. The Blue and White Party has always been, we for as soon as possible in a disengagement. In other words, we want to get ourselves out of the Palestinians' lives. There's no way. We don't want to annex 2.5 million Palestinians in the West Bank. We don't want to tell them how to live their lives. We want to have essentially a divorce and pull back, okay? We think we can do that immediately and still have security, maintain the Israeli presence on the Jordanian border, but that is one of the major differences. We don't feel that the occupation is a healthy thing. We want to try to minimize that kind of role and try to open up a new chapter. That's vague, but that's the nature of being a political party and wanting to still have support from right-wing people who agree with that sentiment, but are very, very nervous about what we're pulling out of the West Bank entirely, because we did that in the Gaza Strip and have been rewarded from that particular act by being essentially bombed nonstop for the last 10 years since we gave that opportunity, and they just took the opportunity to attack us. So it's a very, very sort of fine dance, but certainly our position is to be different and not to be as hands-on in the occupation as the president.
I would just quickly, add to that, and that's a full answer, that of course the occupation entails kind of humiliation for Palestinians, frustration, suffering, human rights violations, and all those things. I think power corrupts, and an occupation corrupts in terms of the power one has over that. And there have been several Israeli prime ministers who've actually campaigned on that and talked to that. Even Ariel Sharon started talking about the occupation, the corrupting influence of the occupation in 2000. So I think there is a realization by some sectors of the society of that, but a kind of disillusionment and frustration how to end it while providing for security. And of course, it seems like the best avenue may be peace negotiations. And then there have been at different times, at different degrees, reasons why we haven't had peace negotiations that successfully get to an agreement. And there's so many contributing factors to that. Sometimes it depends on which Israeli prime minister is in power, and Netanyahu has been more reluctant than others who have been more serious about it. Sometimes, of course, it's Hamas that, even during Oslo, was ramping up suicide bombings because they were against a two-state solution or against peace negotiations going towards a two-state solution. So you have different actors at different times, and sometimes not simultaneously contributing to why you can't get into agreement, and also mistakes that mediators in the U.S. have done. So that's a whole other thing. But But on the hopeful side to that, I would say that I think everyone pretty much knows more or less what a two-state solution peace agreement will look like in terms of all the previous negotiations and work that has already gone into it. So we're very close to knowing what it could happen. And I've heard myself publicly in an interviewing with Saeed Erekat, who's been the main Palestinian negotiator for years on the part of the Palestinian Authority, Shlomo Ben Ami, who's been a negotiator under Ehud Barak, saying we basically have finished the negotiations in many ways, and what we need is brave political leadership simultaneously on the Palestinian side, Israeli side, American, and maybe also others involved in terms of Egypt or Jordan or Saudi Arabia that can simultaneously at the same time have brave leaders who are willing to do this. And part of it institutionally we can see that it's sometimes difficult to make these dramatic changes on the Israeli side, and also on the Palestinian side right now. I think there was a report just in the last 48 hours that 6% of Palestinians oppose Mahmoud Abbas continuing the leadership in the Palestinian Authority, and he's very weak and suffers in terms of legitimacy. So you have kind of right now a lot of things going into it that make peace negotiations more difficult. I think racism is part of it, and racism exists in Israel like in many other countries to different degrees. I think prejudice and racism is exacerbated in times of conflict, right? So when the U.S. is in conflict in different wars, you see prejudice being exacerbated and dehumanizing one's enemy and back and forth. So that's part of it. But I don't think that's the main thing going on. So for instance, when people compare Israel to South Africa as if it's like a white supremacist ideology that's the main driver of the occupation or conflict, I think that's a misunderstanding and misnomer too. It's basically a tragic conflict among two nationalisms that's the base of it, and racism and prejudice fall from that and are exacerbated from that, but is not kind of the main root of the conflict.
I want to be a little more stringent about this. I think it's a largely question of the official policies. If you look at the textbooks that Palestinian children learn, they are extremely virulently anti-Israel and feed a narrative of hatred. Okay, I hear the education that my daughter got prior to going to be a soldier in the West Bank, and the constraints put upon her, and the emphasis on respecting the dignity of people. Now, there's a lot of excess because these are 19-year-old kids that are doing these kind of things. But in terms of the policy, I think there's no benign occupation, but there's certainly not the same kind of intentional racism.
In terms of terrorism, luckily it's not rampant, although it exists in part of it. And of course, Our Boys is on now on HBO, which shows a terrorist act of some Jewish religious people who killed a Palestinian innocent, I think 14 or 15 and 16-year-old in the aftermath or for revenge of 3 Jewish Israelis or 10. So it's done well. I mean, it has controversy or whatever, but that focuses on it. It's made by both Jewish and Palestinian Israelis kind of to take seriously, even though it's not doesn't happen luckily frequently. When it happens, to look into it and to kind of have conversations about it.
We're kind of at the end of time. Is there more final question? We can one last question perhaps.
Yeah. So the Israeli Labour Party lost almost all of their seats, which is pretty similar to a lot of European countries, which obviously don't have that kind of there's nothing similar to the Palestinian issue in France, even though they both saw the class for similar parties. Do you think there's any sort of economic issues like we see in Europe that would also be sort of crushing the center left in Israel, or?
I think that if we want, in my own personal opinion, why I joined the Blue and White Party, even though if you sort of map me out, I might be closer to one of the leftist parties. I think that in order for us to have the kind of liberal democracy that we cherish in Israel, we have to redesign the political map, okay? In fact, one of the things we talk about in the Blue and White Party, interestingly, is that we aspire to be like the Democrats in America, okay? Broad, there's a lot of, you've got your sort of more progressive wing there, and you've got your Bernie Sanders Democrats, and you've got your Joe Biden Democrats, and they're all under one tent. And we think we can be that party in Israel, in blue and white, okay? And literally, the closest person debating that said that is the goal to become the Democrats, okay? So, in that scenario, we don't really have the Labor Party as sort of a relic of the past, an old socialist thing which had a time in Israel which is now gone. I think the national ideology is pretty much consensus, a capitalism, but a capitalism with a heart, with a very tight safety net,
sort of a social welfare system, much like you have in most countries in Europe. That is consensus. That's not a right-left issue. So the right-left distinctions have always been about the territories, give back. And now we think we'd like to talk about, right, the more on the question that you believe, are in favor of a liberal democracy that guarantees rights, that strengthens institutions, that give people freedom, or do you want to do something that's dark on the other side of the map? That's how I think we want to frame it, so that we can get away from a polarization which really has been very, very unsuccessful for the left for the last 20 years. So that's not
Well, we'll stick around if anybody has other questions. So hopefully it gave you more questions than answers.
And for
to
my
keep
students of
delving into.
335, now you have the real job of forming the coalition next week in our 2 weeks from now. But start preparing your papers because the job is full.
Culture Society